Welcome to the ALIA Graphic Podcast, and today we have a really exciting creator chat with a comics creator from Tasmania, who also makes music and also has been the coordinator for the comics art workshop. I'm Georgi Rutia, and I'm the convener for the ALIA Graphic Novels and Comics group. This wonderful group of volunteers who love comics and libraries. But before we get started with our special guest, as a national group based across the land we call Australia, we would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. This was and always will be Aboriginal land. I personally would specifically like to acknowledge the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation as the custodians of the land from where I'm speaking, where I live and work. And I pay respect to the elders past and present of all First Nations people across the land and thank them for their rich storytelling traditions and art. Today's guest is Josh Santospirito, a multimedia artist, musician, comics creator. His previous two graphic novels are The Long Weekend in Alice Springs and Swallows. He has just recently published a beautiful graphic novel, The Islands Where We Left Our Ancestors, published by Scribe, which is a beautiful edition. And you should absolutely buy it for your library and for yourself as well. Why not? And maybe even gift it to other people. I'm so excited to talk to him today. Welcome to the show, Josh.
Well, thanks for having me, Yorgi. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of where I am, which is I'm on the land of the Muwinina people. The Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre is always quick to point out that there's no known descendants of the Muwinina people. So to say that this land is stolen is putting it very lightly. I'd like to acknowledge the Polawa and Pakana people of the island of Latroita.
Yeah. That's so anyway, how have you been? You've been busy, I imagine, in the lead up to the publication and now promoting the book.
Yeah. Publication date's July the 2nd. And yeah, I'm organizing a massive book tour across Australia. And I've, as I've done in previous times, I've taken my graphic novel and tried to make a sort of storytelling performance out of it, audiovisual performance. And I've gotten a bandmate of mine, Natalia Bing, to join me on a national tour to the Northern Territory, Melbourne, all of regional Tasmania.
Yep.
Sydney, did I say Melbourne? Yeah, so we've got a lot of touring to do, which is going to be really fun, and hopefully bring the story to people who aren't necessarily comics readers, as people who like performance or music, and
yeah,
so that's a lot of organisation, but I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be really quite fun.
When's the day in Melbourne?
The day in Melbourne is going to be at the Museo Italiano, which is in Faraday Street in Carlton, just around the corner from Reading Store, and that will be the Thursday, the 25th of July. A book launch there. Bernard Kallio is going to launch it. Bernard, the Kallio family actually come from the same island as the Santospirito family.
Wow.
The Islands north of Sicily is a bunch of volcanic islands, and so Bernard is the best person, the most perfect person, a comics enthusiast, a descendant of Aeolian people. He's the perfect person to be launching this book. So, and, he's a comics creator and a great speech maker and a great launcher of books. So, it's everything encased in one human being. So, yeah.
I love Bernard. And actually, Bernard is one of the big reasons why this group exists. Because very early on, I met him, I think 2018 or something like that. And we had a great conversation. And I said to him, I'm a librarian, and we talked about libraries and comics, and he was very, very encouraging, and he put me in contact with a librarian in a collections coordinator in Sydney, and the whole thing kind of started. So yeah, I love Bernard. Yes. Anyway, we're not here to talk about Bernard. Beautiful man he is. Let's talk about you. As a kid, did you read comics, and which ones? And if you went to the library actually for comics, we want to hear about that as well. Or your relationship with libraries.
Oh my goodness, I still remember the librarian that I used to go visit all the time. His name was Patrick, I think he became a pastor after he left the libraries, but he was there when I was to Camberwell Library in Melbourne, in the Boroondara area. And I used to walk down there quite regularly. And at home, we owned about 16 or 17 very tattered Asterix comics, which my older brothers had and I inherited. Mum had sticky taped them all together. But I really liked walking down to the Camberwell Library to borrow the Asterix books that I didn't have. Sometimes, weirdly, I would borrow the ones that I did have to bring them home and compare and contrast, I don't know, Asterix comics. Of course, I loved Garfield because it was big in the 80s when I was a kid. But probably the most important one, I think, was Foot Rot Flats comics, which is a New Zealand comic strip by a guy called Murray Ball, who sadly passed away a few years ago. And I don't think as a kid I realized that it wasn't Australian, even though they talked about Kiwis and Aotearoa and New Zealand. I think I registered it as Australian humor. So I think when I was a kid, I kind of understood it as reflecting, you know, my own culture back to me. But as an adult, I realized that it's actually New Zealand. But that one felt very important. It also made comics feel very possible and local to me. On top of that, when I was a kid, my parents were in the local Catholic choir at Our Lady of Victories in Camberwell, and the conductor of the choir was a man named Peter Foster, who made comics professionally. He had comics which were published in the Sydney Morning Herald, and I just grew up thinking that you became a lawyer like my dad, or a plumber, or you became a cartoonist. You know, it was just one of a normal range of things that you grow up and you choose to do. So so I had those. The library was like 7 minutes walk that way to go borrow comics. Walking to my primary school was via just near Peter Foster's house. So sometimes I'd sort of come home and I'd sort of poke my head around the hedge to see if Pete was in his studio with the most amazing drawing desk, one of these ones that fold upwards. Blew my mind as a kid. So comics was sort of everywhere as a kid, though I don't know if I had a wide range of comics. I used to go to the newspaper and cut out the strips and tie them up with elastic bands and put them in a shoebox. So I collected them as well. So Foot Rot Flats, Asterix, a little bit of Tintin, but Asterix was probably more my humor.
Awesome. Awesome. That's me as well. You know, I've always been in the Asterix camp.
It was just funnier, I thought.
I was obsessed with Asterix, and and then Goscinny actually wrote some books as well, Little Nicholas, and I've read those books so many times.
They were translated to English, those ones, but I didn't see that many copies. I think the library had one or two or something, but nowhere near as many. Asterix was just too big a brand, and probably one of the few sort of comics that were just easy to access in Australia in the 80s from France.
So you were reading those. You were always obviously reading comics as a kid. What's your origin story though as a comic creator?
I guess I've always kept a sort of a journal, but the journal has always been a combination of drawings and words. I think at a later stage, maybe when I was already an adult, I started to realize that it was sort of a quasi comics inside my diary. I often think while I'm drawing and process things by drawing. When I finished high school, I mean, I was very, into art in high school, but then came time for me to go to university or whatever you do after school, and ended up traveling a lot and going to university and not really being very engaged in, just sort of drifted into university without really thinking about what I wanted to do in life. Eventually decided to become a nurse, so I was very non-artistic kind of life I was leading. But then once I became a nurse after a few years of university, I went and lived in Alice Springs in Central Australia to, work as a mental health nurse in Aboriginal communities. And I found that sort of world very hard to process. There's a lot of stuff going on there. Colonization is very raw there. Mental health as a mental health clinician, you're working in that environment is extra weird. I mean, being a mental health clinician by itself is already, a very nuanced and strange thing to be, but then place it in a cross-cultural and cross-linguistic sort of landscape with like lots of strange things going on that are difficult to sort of see the, you know, what are the strings, what are the kind of building blocks that have led to this strange world that we call Australia. So I found myself more and more leaning on my journal and drawing and writing sort of to process all of that. And I worked with this bloke called Craig Senrock, who is a Jungian psychoanalyst, psychotherapist, psychologist, who used to send me lots of articles and stuff that he'd written, which were about trying to unpack modern Australia and try to figure out ways through it. He sent me one piece called A Long Weekend in Alice Springs, and I really connected with it. It was the first piece of writing that didn't say, this is how things are. It said, I don't know how to think about these things. And so I really gravitated to this sort of way of thinking. And even after I left Alice Springs and moved to Tasmania about 16 years ago, I was still reading it, and I started drawing it just sort of to delve into this very meditative kind of way of thinking about what I'd seen.
Yeah.
And after a couple of years of doing this, I realized, oh, hang on, this is a very large project. It's an art project. It's possibly a graphic novel. And that was kind of almost the first comic I'd ever done since I was about 12. So so I didn't really do too many zines or short comics. I almost found myself inadvertently making a graphic novel as my first comic. And and that took me 5 years, and it was a book. So
when you find the right story, you know, you just get your head in it, and it's like, I need to do this. This just feels right, I guess.
Yeah, it didn't always feel right. It's a very difficult comic. It follows some dark things and stuff that I'm not sure about still to this day. I didn't think anyone would read it because it's a comic.
I have.
Oh, okay. It's a comic based on an academic piece of writing. It's obscure, so I thought it'd be a bit of a novelty, and I was a bit terrified that it sort of seemed to gain some traction. So obviously a lot of other people, you know, particularly in Central Australia, who have worked cross-culturally, it just sold a lot there. And so that almost makes me more scared. I think that a lot of people have read it.
We still have 2 copies at my library. So.
Oh, really? Goodness.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
I self-published it and self-distributed it, but I'm still amazed to hear where it's gone. I don't even know how it would have ended up in the libraries over there, but
it's before I started working at the library, so someone else bought it. But I find really interesting what you're saying, because I find that your comics are always feel quite personal, and they feel like a diary kind of thing. They always have a little bit of that feel, you know. You do that really well. In fact, talking about this, you've published 2 other graphic novels. So you talked about that one, and the other one is Swallows.
Yep.
Looking back now, what can you tell us about them and their creation and publication process? How do you look at them now? I know sometimes it's hard as a creator.
All 3 books, or just Swallows, or?
Just the first 2.
Oh, the first 2. Self-publishing. I mean, there wasn't a lot of publishers back then, and that isn't that long ago. I mean, I did publish Swallows in 2015. But goodness, like Allen and Unwin are really the only publishers who've been publishing anything really for a long period of time. They're the first ones who published their first book publisher in Australia to publish a graphic novel back in 2006, which is not even 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Greenberg's The Great Gatsby. So, and you know, I guess I'm the type of person, broadly speaking, who doesn't wait for permission to make art. I've made lots of albums, you know, made lots of zines. You know, I can't wait for someone else to give me permission to do something. So I feel pretty comfortable about I mean, I've turned my shed into a gallery space, and I sometimes have friends put on exhibitions in my shed. And you know, that's fun. You know, like waiting for an institution or a publisher to kind of pick your work up is like, you could be waiting years. In fact, I did wait years. So in the meantime, I can still shop it round and see if someone will pick it up. But when they don't, I'm still quite prepared to self-publish. It is hard work. Looking back on it, I learnt a lot. I don't know if I could learn much more. Like I know how to contact bookshops and do a lot of that selling, and I'm very comfortable kind of putting myself out there, which I know a lot of people are not necessarily comfortable with that sort of thing. Having the, and I think comics take so long that you do need to be self-driven to complete them. They take years. Like the first book, it's just a black and white book, The Long Weekend in Alice Springs, and that still took me 5 years to make.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know what I was doing, but maybe not knowing what I was doing, that being a bit naive, like I just sort of probably helped me to keep going.
Yeah.
I also didn't think anyone would read it, which probably also, that was also naive, which meant that I felt safe in doing something, which was still a bit murky. But then after I finished that, I think I realized that it was such a heavy book that I had to do something a lot lighter. So my next book, Swallows, it's a very slim book. It's got much more flow to it. It's on a topic which is very safe. It's my own family and sort of a bit of love in that sort of book. And I think I needed that to almost sort of get over the kind of trauma of having been spent 5 years on such a dark topic. And I carried that over into my third book, which is, you know, the islands where we left our ancestors. That was the most joyous experience. And I think I've cracked the code. If you want to spend years, this took me about 6 years, and it's color, which adds on an extra year or two of work. Make your book about people you love and make it funny, you know, because you're going to be spending, you know, months and months and months in a studio by yourself. You might as well make sure that you're working on it with characters, with people, you know, friends, or, you know, there's a lot of love in this project. And I think that made it a really wonderful experience. It took me sort of 3 books to kind of work out this. So if you're a new creator out there, just start with a book about people you love, and I think you're going to have a much more fun time with it. But a lot of people have trauma in their lives, and sometimes you have to work through the trauma as your first book. But just know that you still have to live with that trauma while you're working on the book.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting as well. What you're saying about, you know, doing things yourself and not being afraid to, well, you know, don't ask him for permission and all that. And I I think it's the Comics Art Workshop is a really interesting project here in Australia, and I don't know of many others or anything really similar around the world. And it's a really, really interesting project. I know you didn't create it. I know other people started it. And we have actually spoken to Pat before, for example, and things like that. But yeah, you were at one point, you were actually the organizer of a comic art workshop with Larry Harris. And you have also been a participant of the comics art workshop. You know, so maybe if you can talk a little bit about that, what it was like, one being, you know, one of the organizers of it, and also being participating in it and developing your graphic novel there, or yeah.
Well, I mean, the Comic Art Workshop, or CORE as us insiders like to call it, CORE, just for short. It is an artist-run initiative, and the organisers are participants, I guess. So it's very non-hierarchical. So if you are an organiser, or one of the co-directors, as we call them, for organisational purposes, we get to be called co-directors, and you organise the residency and put it on, and but you also get to bring your own project and workshop that, just like all the other participants do. So. And I think that's important internally, that everyone's on the same level, because it is a peer-run workshop. It's not like we're teaching how to make comics. Everyone who comes is working on their own project, and they just want to bring it to get other eyes on the project. As a participant the first time, though, like in 2015, so it's 9 years old this year, the organisation, we came to Maria Island, which is off the east coast of Tasmania, and isolated island that you can only get to by ferry, and it's in an old penal settlement that we came to. Pat and Liz were very open at the very start that they didn't know how it would go, that it was kind of an experiment. They had some ideas being educators, but it was amazing. I guess within a few days we'd sort of figured out, I guess, how to workshop graphic novels and became very close friends. And because the residency's been every 2 years, more or less, since, give or take, with COVID,
Mhm.
it's been extraordinary watching that the side effects of core, which is like other communities which have come together because of the relationships that were formed at the residency. So the residency was put together so that we could workshop graphic novels, and that's its prime motivation. And that happened, and certainly robust workshopping happens with people who know about graphic novels and are working on their own graphic novels and have learned from each other's practice. That definitely happened, but there's also this side
Yeah.
effect of having this organization happen, which over 9 years now, that there's other communities are coming together, like Read to Me in Sydney, festivals like PCAF over in Perth has probably benefited. I think it's, you could argue, from core. They've also, the community over in Perth are also running their own sort of workshops, sort of semi-based on core. Max Lowe over in Malaysia, who came to one of the cores, has also done something similar. He's put on a workshopping thing over in Kuala Lumpur, which is amazing.
Yep.
Paper Cuts in Adelaide, Gina and Owen, who run that, have been part of Core's fabric, and I think have the networks to kind of put on those sort of festivals. Really amazing kind of networking based on the friendships that were forged by locking people together for 2 weeks in a remote location. In some ways, I think that's almost a much more bigger outcome from this residency. However, there's been some great books coming out of the residency, and my new book was workshopped at the 2019 residency.
Yes.
They really improved the book. It was, I had a lot of it was sort of coming together at that stage, but some key sort of feedback that I got would help me kind of rearrange the information and make it more flow more nicely. And yeah, I think it's a better book for it. So.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And what you're saying, it's actually a really, really good point. Yeah. Because I think there is a tendency, and I think we have done it ourselves in our podcast as well, to focus on the titles that and the graphic novels that have come out of the workshops. But I think your point is really important as well, that it has had a big effect on other things as well, and in building community, really.
Yeah, there's this cool term that Brian Eno uses. He sort of argues against this idea of genius, because artists who are geniuses never happen in a vacuum, and he calls it scenes, as in like the scene. Fosters projects that come out of it, or artists that might come out of it that are more well to people. They don't often happen by themselves. And Pat Grant, who started Core, is very fond of the expression, "A rising tide lifts all boats." And Core is kind of part of this sort of effort to lift a whole bunch of people's art practice to another level, and to support each other in doing that. And I think that's actually the great outcome of Core. I think it's really benefited the community more broadly across Australia, and I think more books are going to come out of Australia, which weren't even workshopped in Core, but have sort of benefited from a better, stronger network. It's been very cool to watch.
And I remember Bernard from early on telling me, Jurgi, there's no comics industry in Australia, but what we have is a really good comics community, and so I started learning from him. So thank you, Bernard. Anyway, well, we should move to talking about your book. So we'll show it again. The islands where we left our ancestors. When you traveled with your parents, which is essentially what the story in this graphic novel, when you traveled with your parents over there, did you already have an idea to do the book, or did the book come out, like the idea for the book developed after the trip, and you thought, there's something here, maybe from your diary?
Yeah. So I envisaged originally, like as far back as 2013, that I would make a series of books about migration, about family histories, but also just about migration more broadly. And I wanted them to be all called Swallows, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. So I had the original kernels of the idea for this book were as far back as that. And so I had a theme.
Yeah.
I wanted the first book to be about when people migrate to a new place and they start to embed themselves in a new place. So I guess I used as a case study my grandfather migrating from Italy to Melbourne and slowly becoming part of the fabric of Melbourne. And then I envisaged part 2 to be about going back to where he came from and exploring why he left. And that's what this book sort of is. And it's about why people leave, or why people, the whole history of human movement, I guess, and how that's actually the history of all humankind is about how people move. So I had these sort of broad themes in mind. I did want to go back to Salina, the islands in the Aeolian Islands, which my grandfather came from, and to do a research trip. But my father's also very engaged in sort of exploring his genealogy. And so I tentatively said, Dad, do you want to come with me? And he thought about it for a bit and then said yes. And then, of course, my mum said, oh, I'll come too. And I had an inkling that a family trip to the Aeolian Islands would make a great vehicle for exploring all of these things, using everyday family dynamics and our journey of discovery as a way of exploring all of these different sort of themes that I was kind of interested in. And I think, it's pretty easy to kind of sort of think family bickering, a little bit of family gossip. That's going to keep the book really,
yes,
fun and interesting whilst we explore these kind of more somewhat philosophical, historical ideas. So I did have an inkling. I just didn't know how it would go, and I was totally fine with that. I also thought that you can have conversations with your father about family history, in Camberwell, a suburban setting, but you're going to have different conversations when you're over there in the place where you're sort of actually sort of kind of living the exploration of genealogy. And I had a couple of key conversations, both of which have ended up in the book, which really, I remember the one conversation where I went, that's the heart of the book. That's it. That's the dark emotion. I kind of wrote it, quickly drew it and wrote it in my sketchbook. And so those things, you can mine real life for good storytelling,
yeah. Obviously, I live in Australia. I have a very strong accent. I don't. I grew up somewhere else. My son's 13 now as well. He was born here. But he says he's bilingual. He speaks Basque and he speaks English, and he's got a connection to the Basque Country, and he says he's Basque. And it's great to travel there with him and to be able to show him places, and the connection there. And you're right, it's a totally different conversation being here or being there, So for me, actually reading it, I felt a connection as well, because yes, I'm the one who came here, but I have often thought of what it's going to be like for him and how he sees the Basque Country and the family there and the history and all that. So I think that on the one hand, it's a very personal story, but on the other hand, it's a very universal one because most Australians are migrants, as we know.
Yeah. I think I've read sort of family stories which are all family stories are personal but they're not always interesting. But I think almost always a family story provokes you to think about your own story, and that is where the interestingness comes. It's almost what the readers bring to a book, which completes the interestingness about a book. So when making an autobiographical story, you're always like, oh gosh, is this interesting? And so I was always very keen to connect it to the universality and sort of the broader strokes of all human history, as a way of, I guess, ensuring that it remained relevant. But I also kept in the back of my mind that whoever reads this is gonna, there is something universal about this, and I could keep it a personal story if I wanted, and it would still be, you know, relatable and yeah.
Your art in this graphic novel is beautiful. I really loved it. And I love that it actually feels really organic and textured, with a beautiful use of colors as well. Can you take us maybe through some of the creative choices that you made, and your process for this? Because I think it really adds to it. It feels really organic. It's a personal story as well. And I think that really adds to the book, you know?
Yeah. So part of the book, I mean, these are the original pages. This is, I use this this pen, this dip pen, old-fashioned dip pen, and I drew on watercolor paper with black ink. This nib was given to me by my friend Lee Ragozzi, who is also a comic maker here in Nipaluna, Hobart. And I got all this watercolor paper, and I fully intended to ink all these pages and then watercolor the entire book. Now, for those of you who have never worked with watercolor and have never made a graphic novel, that is madness. That is crazy. If you then watercolor all of the pages and you make a mistake, you then have to ink the page again and then watercolor. You know, it would be crazy. So I inked this all in lockdowns in Tasmania, which was only a few months. It wasn't a terribly long lockdown here in Tasmania because we've got a moat to keep COVID out.
Yes.
Natural protection. So they locked down for a few months. I can't remember exactly. And then in that time, I had inked majority of the book. This book is also about the process of drawing and how that helps you process things. The process of drawing as a way of connecting is a sort of major thread in the book. So being an artist is sort of part of the narrative voice. So, and this book had to look like it was drawn by hand, which it was. However, I did make the decision to color it digitally to save myself great gnashing of teeth and pulling out my hair. So I did color it on my iPad using the Procreate app, which, for those who don't know, is actually from Hobart, Tasmania. The Procreate team down here in North Hobart, a world-beating app used by people all over the planet, and it's Australian. So that felt like a nice little thing. But I wanted to make sure that even though I was coloring it digitally, that it had to look to the untrained eye like it wasn't made on a computer. In fact, nothing on this book except for the barcode on the back is made without a hand in it. So I was drawing digitally on the tablet. Everything here is drawn digitally, including the writing is redrawn, even in font. I hand sort of copied it, and that was because the whole heart of the book is about the hand as a way of kind of seeing the world. So so that was a major sort of focus, I guess. So I'm glad to hear that, you know, it felt organic and it felt handmade, I guess, because
Totally.
that's
Totally. And I think exactly what I said. I feel like that actually those creative choices that you made there really come through, and they really make it feel like a very special, personal, and very personal kind of book. You know, it's So definitely, absolutely.
You said earlier that my writing kind of reminds you of a diary. I mean, that was a specific choice. In fact, whilst I was traveling over in the with my parents, I had a sketchbook which was landscape sketchbook. I think it was just a coincidence, but I realized whilst I was over there that it lent itself to artworks which were about horizons, and so that's what sort of where I came up with the creative choice of doing a book which was in horizontal, because it just really works with the themes I guess I was exploring. And my publisher, when I eventually found a publisher, they thought that was one of the strengths, I guess, of the book, and completely agreed with the decision of making a horizontal book, even though making a horizontal book is pretty tough on the spine, because it has connective tissue, and over time, I guess, there's more leverage for breaking the book. So we made the decision to make it hardcover, and
Yeah.
and very well bound in the spines
Yes.
to fight
Yeah.
those issues which might come up over time.
Since you mentioned the publisher,
Mhm.
I think it's your first time working with a major publisher as well,
Yeah, for a
and
book. Yeah, yeah.
an editor. So what was this experience like? You know?
It was good. I mean, I had finished the book, I guess.
Yeah.
Shopped it around for a year or so while I did other like projects, and I w- it was sort of around sort of COVID, sort of the tail end of COVID. So I didn't really know what that meant for the publishing world. So I wasn't in a hurry to get it off, into the
Yeah.
world. Didn't know if it was, the supply chain disrupted and all that sort of thing. I wasn't sure if it was a great idea for releasing a book in that time. Um,
Hmm.
and whilst I was doing that, I was also working with Island Magazine, which is a Tasmanian-based literary magazine, which is one of the long-standing literary magazines of Australia. Um, on a graphic narratives project, I was the curator, guest curator for them, and that the thrust behind that project was, well, we need to get more comics into literary spaces because they're locked out and it's really frustrating.
Yeah.
And I was whinging very publicly on the forum previously known as Twitter, um, about such things, and it led me to have sort of some conversations. And one of these conversations was with David Golding, who is the head editor at Scribe magazine, Scribe Publications, and he was very sympathetic. And I ended up having a beer with him when I was over in Melbourne visiting my parents one time, and um, I said, "Oh, I've got a manuscript, a comics manuscript sitting around." He said, "Oh, send it to me. I'll have a read." And um, he was very interested and showed it around his office, and they were all interested in, and they felt that it was had a wide enough appeal that it would probably work quite well for a book publisher to take on. Scribe is also one of the few book publishers taking on graphic novels. Um,
Yeah.
so I guess I had a fully completed manuscript. He felt that structurally it was pretty good, so there wasn't much to change in story structure, which would involve like massive changes to the way the book was arranged in its story. It was probably more a case of just fixing up sentences. Certainly, proofreading was a big one, but
Yeah.
hand lettered everything in ink as well. So, um, there's some nuts and bolts issues with fixing that up, but that's
Yeah.
completely surmountable. That was fine.
Yeah.
But really pleasant, and he's a really lovely fellow. And I've reached an age. I'm in my 40s now. I like working with people that I like working with. I don't really want to work with people I don't want to work with. And
Yeah.
so I was rapt that such a nice person was interested in the book and
Yeah.
worked with me on it. And
I've met him just the other day, actually, in book launch. Like we've exchanged emails and things like that for a bit, like he's kept me informed about books coming out and things like that. But yeah, I just met him in the launch of 12 Rules for Strife.
yeah.
Um,
Well, yeah. So he's taken on Sam Warman's books, Luke and Kelly Jackson's graphic novels. He's going to be releasing Rachel Ang's book later this year,
yeah.
which has been published by Drawn and Quarterly in North America, and Scribe here, and who else?
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, who
Yeah.
else?
So yeah, I'm glad to see another publisher, picking up our graphic novels.
Our graphic novels. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yes. Yeah. Because I mean, we know why there's always such a big focus on junior graphic novels.
Yeah.
They are very popular.
Yeah, I mean, where do YA readers graduate to once they become adults? We need adult graphic novels. Like, Alan and Unwin have done an amazing job of continuing, children's and YA graphic novels over the years as one of the
Yes.
only publishers really in Australia. And
Yeah.
certainly there's an interest in picking up YA everywhere now. I think COVID shot manga sales through the roof, and I think they all started to wake up and they all want to publish YA because it's a much surer bet money-wise than adult stuff. But
Yeah.
I want to see the adult stuff developed. I want to see the audiences developed, and I need to
Yeah.
So my hat is off to Scribe.
Yes. Now, coming towards the end, more or less, but comics take a very long time to make, as we've heard today. and we've heard many times before.
Yeah.
You probably can't really talk about it much, but being a little bit cheeky, what's next for you? Do you already have some other project in mind, or is there a third chapter in this series?
I don't know if there's a third chapter in the series. I think I put that out of my mind for the time being. I do have a project which I still don't know if I will do, but I've had this project for 11 years now. It is another piece of comic project based on the writings of Craig Senrock, and it's called Sydney Purgatorio. Those Italian scholars in your audience will recognize the word Purgatorio as being the second part of Dante's Divine Comedy. This is a comics manuscript from November 2022. Yeah, so it's this kind of slightly esoteric combining of various metaphors, like purgatory as a place of pain, but also a place of hope, where people might, it's got migration also as part of it. Sydney is a site of migration from the old world into the new world, and
yeah,
a lot of psychogeography is sort of a part of this. It's got a lot about architecture and cities as a site of holding stories of pain and darkness, and how do we inhabit these spaces. So it's a lot of I think this work, if I ever do actually follow it through and complete it, it's going to be very labor intensive, because it's all well and good to draw islands with horizons as a straight line, but when you have to draw buildings and lots of people, I mean, that's a very labor intensive drawing. Ask Chris Gooch, he will tell you it takes a long time to draw a drawing with lots of people and lots of architecture in it.
Yes,
I usually avoid it, but if I was to ever complete this project, I mean, this would be a magnum opus, though, and I say that not to sort of as a brag. I say this almost with like oh gosh, I don't know if I have it in me to follow this through, because I can see how big it is. I've done 3 major comics now. I've rewritten this book maybe 4 or 5 times now, and then have put it aside just because I can feel the weight of work. Even starting the final art would be, but it is also brilliant. Craig's original piece that I based this on has maybe 5 or 6 just outstanding concepts, sort of bubbling through it, and I think that's what made me excited about it.
I think if you had the story in your mind for so long, and you've done all these different versions and all that, there will come a time when you'll feel like, I don't think the story is going away. I think there will be a time when you feel like, okay, now I'm ready for it.
Maybe I think some other things in my life would have to come together. Like I'd have to find a wealthy patron who is willing to just pay all my bills for about 2 or 3 or 4 years.
I haven't won the lottery yet, but if I do, I'll let you know.
The other thing about that whole project is, because it's referencing Dante's Purgatorio, I have to also reference all of the artists who ever sort of taken on Dante's Purgatory, which includes ridiculous artists like Gustave Doré, William Blake, Salvador Dali. There's incredible history, which is sort of also part of the visual fabric of the Dante canon. And so these lofty sort of things are part of it, and I can't disentangle it. And gosh, it would take a long time, I think, to complete the art that I have in my mind for it. I don't know. I can't conceive of my life being a good bed for that yet. Maybe in the future, perhaps.
Now, actually, one final question before. The last question is penultimate question, I should say. Working on personal stories and histories like you do can be quite tricky sometimes, because you're putting your own personal history, obviously, but you're also putting other characters who are real. In this case, your parents, but and you are telling real stories. So how do you balance, that, like how much of your personal history and their lives you put there, and getting permission for that, but also, taking artistic licenses or sticking to the real history? How do you balance all that? Tricky question, I know, but
Oh no, I mean that's probably at the heart of like the balancing act of still making a good story, picking what I also know my parents. I know that I pushed them a little bit, but I don't think I pushed them too much over the stuff that was contained in this book. There's a bit of family gossip there, which I think makes the book very fun. And I don't think they disagree, though I haven't asked them explicitly. Um, but yeah, there is a balancing act between making sure that you are looking after the people you know, who you love, and making sure that they're still on board with the stuff that you put out into the world. I love taking artistic licenses with reality. I mean, this book has a great character, which is Aeolus, the god of the winds, and I just hang out with him a lot. And
yeah,
that's just me, or an excuse to have a conversation with myself about some of the ideas that have been kicking around my head. But I love speaking with gods, because it's like, or speaking with like ghosts, because I think that's me speaking with the landscape. This is a sort of psychogeographic idea. Someone who is like my guide throughout the islands, kind of like Dante's Purgatory. Like he had some guides who took him through the afterlife
yeah.
and explained it to him, and then you have conversations, and they reveal stories which you wouldn't be able to see otherwise. Like I think that's a really great literary device which has been tried and true, and I think it's quite fun. And in this case, I sort of made Aeolus. I liked this idea that gods, they're kind of like parasites on humans. They're always taking from us. So Aeolus is always bumming beer off me, or food, or money for the ferry rides. Like, and he's a little bit annoying, but he also is a beautiful kind of has a few key moments where he says something which kind of lands in my brain, and actually, so I've paid him for these, paid the toll for these wisdoms, I guess, which
Yes.
um, yeah, I like those kind of interactions. I think they kind of give stories a really interesting flavor, just
It
by
was
borrowing.
a really great addition. It's a great character in the book. I really loved it. So, and your interactions with him. So definitely a really great addition.
Yeah, I was thinking. I don't know if you read. Eddie Campbell had a series called Bacchus, where he had the god, Dionysus, the god of revelry, or wine, or
Yep.
whatever, as the main character, just sort of wandering through the earth, and dealing with humans. And I think I thought a lot about Eddie Campbell's work whilst I was, um, yeah, playing with Aeolus. I thought, not that he was. So my partner met Craig Sanrock less than a year ago, and she was like, "Did you base Aeolus on Craig Sanrock?" And I was like, "I didn't think of that, but I can see what you're saying." Certain cheekiness to Craig, which I think is perhaps
Yeah.
somehow.
Josh, at the end, we always ask our guests to recommend about 3 comics or graphic novels or manga or whichever you prefer. And it could be titles that influence you for this book or as a creator, or something that you read recently and you hope other people will pick up.
Yep.
Um, whatever way you want to take it.
I would say influence this book specifically, and also my practice more broadly, is all the works by David B. or David Bay, as I guess a French person, David Bay. I don't know how to speak French, but he's an amazing writer, most well known for Epileptic. Um, but he has a whole bunch of other works which combine and blend history, memory, dreams, personal story, and I think that was kind of probably a touchstone for what ended up being in the islands where we left our ancestors. Um, a great artist, really important, I think, in the history of comics, because I think he didn't necessarily do things that hadn't been done before, but just the density with which he did them is sort of brought something new to comics. Stuff that I've read recently, which Still Alive by Safdar. Yeah, just one of the more important comics to come out of Australia, and has been recognised as such. Saf, beautiful human, amazing black and white artist, really riffing off heavy metal iconography. And I really love when comics are not just using comics as their touchstones. I really love it when people bring stuff from other mediums into comics.
Mm.
I want to see more of that. I think that's really brings, because comics being, say a comic artist who's just sort of basing their storytelling on the history of comics. I think we actually have a whole arsenal of other mediums at our tools. We've got prose, we've got poetry, because you can make illustrated poetry. We've got all of the visual sort of information that we can of the history of humankind, and I think that really can maximize the impact that comics can have. And I think this book has that in spades. Also, really great expose of the Australian Immigration Detention Centre story of this country. And it's really raw and beautiful. And I think the rawness comes alive because of the use of heavy metal like sort of imagery. So very deft, an amazing writer. I'm going to plug this one. I'm in it. This is an anthology, but this is called Future Literata. Lee Ragozzi, who gave me this pen, and Richie Singler are the, I guess, curators, we'll call them, or they might call themselves editors of this anthology. This is all Tasmanians or Literatans, I guess, if that's the word, are in this. It's not just comics. There is visual, there's some prose, there's some visual sort of intense kind of visual kind of stuff going on here, which is sort of just, I guess, contemporary art. There's a whole bunch of comics. There's Tom O'Hearn's just bonkers sort of drawings in here. But this is a very lush production. Just the amazing comic by Tim Hodge, who lives one suburb away from me. Lee Ragozzi's amazing watercolored art with his incredible character, the Fool, who is kind of, I guess, kind of Lee, but kind of someone else. Lee loves this character. He's kind of the wise man, the Fool, a great icon. Yeah, it's very rare that you get something like this. I guess fans of Kramer's Ergo from the States, or sort of massive anthology projects, people might remember the Blood and Thunder anthology 1 and 2, which came out in Australia, which Lee Ragozzi also played a major role in. That was all published and printed on risographs, but this one's printed with offset printing and is exquisite. You can find it at the Literata. I think Future Literata, I think, has their own webpage, so you can buy it there and have it sent to you. Probably wouldn't be on the mainlands in too many places, but certainly available in bookshops in Tasmania. This was published last year, and I think no Australian comics collection is complete without it. It's really quite an amazing hardcover, beautiful green with this sort of red font on the front. It's just yummy.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And yeah, everyone, the island where we left our ancestors is now published by Scribe. So go and buy it.